Mere Christianity is the name of a book by C.S. Lewis. It's also a term that Hank Hanegraaff is promiscuously throwing around on the Bible Answer Man show of late. Hank Hanegraaff is the president of the Christian Research Institute, CRI, a Protestant apologetics organization. The issue is that Hanegraaff converted to Eastern Orthodoxy in April. It's no secret that Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism are incompatible on many issues. But Hanegraaff says that's not a problem since he still believes in quote-unquote mere Christianity. That is to say, the basic core beliefs held by all Christians, whether Western or Eastern. Someone who has raised serious objections to this claim is blogger Perry Robinson. Perry is himself a former Protestant apologist who is now Orthodox. As a matter of interest, he's also a former employee of Hank Hanegraaff. Perry, welcome back.
Glad to be here again, Paul.
Perry, you have stated that Hank Hanegraaff is compartmentalizing his worldview. Explain what compartmentalizing is and why it's bad for systematic theology.
Yeah, by compartmentalization, what I mean is to think of theology as a system of separate boxes with more significant doctrines being in, say, larger boxes forming a foundation, while you then have secondary issues or secondary or less important doctrines in medium and smaller sized boxes put on top of this. And so what Hanegraaff is positioning himself, what he's doing is giving this impression that theology is like that. And what he has simply done is kept all the big boxes on the bottom, like the Trinity and the divinity of Christ and so forth, while changing out secondary issues. Theology doesn't work like that. So theology, you have to think of it like any conceptual scheme, like a web or a system of interlocking parts, or an engine, if you will. You change even something insignificant or seemingly insignificant, and it's going to ripple throughout the whole system and fundamentally change the whole system. You may not be aware of this when you do it, but if you are consistent enough and conscious enough in what you're doing, it will end up changing the whole system. So you really can't take theology to be this kind of system of boxes. And then secondly, Hanegraaff talks as if Orthodox distinctives are therefore secondary issues, like the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Well, this gets us into the land of incoherence. If that was one of the major reasons he converted, well, then now he's converting on the basis of secondary issues. And what is more, the Orthodox don't take the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist to be a secondary issue. That's certainly going to be, on his schema, one of the big boxes. Now, with respect to mere Christianity, as I think Lewis indicated, is an abstraction. It's a pragmatic construal, a waiting room, as Lewis talks about it. And he says you can't stay in the waiting room forever. And as an abstraction, it's a useful tool, but it has serious limitations. First off, there's no church of mere Christianity you can go to. You can't read about the Church of Mere Christianity in 7th century France or in 14th century Constantinople or in 19th century Moscow. There's no mere Christianity church. It's just a concept. But more directly, there's no real common set of doctrines that we all share. People will think, well, of course we do. We have things like the Trinity and the deity of Christ. Well, let's think about that. When we say the Trinity, is that the doctrine of the Trinity with or without the filioque?
Explain what that is.
Catholics, well, the filioque clause is the idea that was inserted into the Nicene Creed in the West in 1014, that the person of the Holy Spirit is produced or generated eternally by the Father and the Son, as opposed in the original creed of Nicene Constantinople, that the Holy Spirit is generated or proceeds from the Father alone. So Roman Catholics and Protestants think that that makes a real difference to the doctrine of the Trinity. Of course, Orthodox reject that doctrine because they think it makes a big difference in the doctrine of the Trinity too. So there's no one neutral concept that we all agree on. Same thing can be said about any number of doctrines. We'll say, well, surely the Nicene Creed, for example, with the deity of Christ. Well, the doctrine of eternal generation of the Son, which is the idea that the Son is eternally generated from the Father from the Father's essence. And so the Son bears an eternal derivative relationship to the Father, essentially, without any kind of subordination or inequality. So many Reformed authors have rejected that doctrine, and many other Protestants have rejected that doctrine.
Thus, what is being characterized as a quote-unquote small box is actually, because of its ramifications, a big box, one of those being the filioque, all of one word, filioque, yet according both to Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, it makes a big difference. So what?
Well, and it's even more than that. It's that there's no concept the general concept that we all share, because either that concept is going to be without the filioque, or the concept of the Trinity is going to be with the filioque. There's no in-between Trinity doctrine between either having that or not having that. So that doesn't mean that there isn't a common historical ground. It just means it's not neutral ground. So Protestant Trinitarianism, you could call Trinitarianism because it bears a similar relationship and is historically, through a very long chain, derived from Orthodoxy. And so it's similar that in certain respects. But if really push comes to shove, we would say it's a mutation. It's distorted. And this is why it's really problematic. It's not orthodoxy, right? It's not true belief. It's not right teaching.
And Perry, what we're asking for, too, is just a little bit more honesty. Now, if Hanegraaff is going to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy and he wants to be a member of the club, then he should accept the club rules, and he should admit, yeah, Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism have different views on the Lord's Supper, which is also called the Eucharist. But to say that it's one of these minor things and doesn't deal with mere Christianity is simply not in accord with reality. It is taken so seriously in the Orthodox Church. I remember once I was in a Greek parish, and a little bit of the wine from the chalice got spilled on the floor. They stopped the entire liturgy, and the priest got down on all fours, and he licked up the bit of the Eucharist that had fallen onto the tiles. So no one can honestly look at this and say that, well, this is just a small box, and we're going to put that in this compartment over here, and if you don't believe it, you can still be a member of the club. I mean, these are pretty grave things.
Yeah, they're not just accidental differences. It's not a preferential treatment. What people have to understand, from the Orthodox point of view, Hanegraaff didn't change denomination. Denomination is a 18th, 19th century Protestant construction to explain how different Protestant bodies have the same core beliefs, but are just different on other issues like church government and things like this. From the Orthodox point of view, Hanegraaff did not change denominations. It's not a matter of style or preference. For us, these are issues of orthodoxy or heresy. We consider people, for example, who advocate a memorialist view of the Eucharist, that it's a symbol in some way and nothing more. We consider that to be heretical. And that doesn't mean those people are necessarily evil people who sacrifice cats and dogs in their backyard and drink up blood or something like that, but it just means they're teaching serious error. I know plenty of Mormons who are really nice people, and they treat their kids well, they love their wives and husbands, but the doctrine is clearly false. So these are not minor issues. So Hanegraaff has this very simplistic understanding of Christian doctrine. It's not this kind of common ground that we all agree on, and then we each have our own particular flavor or take on certain things. There's just no historical instance of that Like I said, there's no Church of Mere Christianity you can join.
The bottom line is, systematic theology does not allow compartmentalization in the facile manner that Hanegraaff and his defender, Cindy Martin Morgan, want to say. Ladies and gentlemen, the blog is energeticprocession.wordpress.com. The blogger is Perry Robinson. Perry, Hanegraaff can claim that he believes in mere Christianity all he wants, but you and I have both recently looked at the Statement of Beliefs. I mean, today's date is July the 30th, 2017. I was just looking at the CRI Statement of Beliefs before I came to the studio. And I want to tell you this, Perry, that Statement of Beliefs is anything but mere Christianity. For example, here is how Article 6 reads, quote, Jesus' death on the cross provided a penal substitutionary atonement for the sins of humanity. In salvation, we are rescued from God's wrath by his unmerited grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. End quote. Perry, what do you make of that?
Well, that's just standard classical Protestant Reformation teaching, that faith is in and of itself a worthless virtue that acts as a conduit or highway for the transfer of moral credit from Christ to us and our wickedness to Christ. That's what Luther called simul justus et peccator, simultaneously saint and sinner. We're classed or grouped as righteous even though we're not, and faith is this kind of extrinsic relation that acts as a highway for the transfer of this credit. The doctrinal statement is clearly Protestant. Now, what your listeners have to understand, to work at CRI, you have to sign this doctrinal statement. And dissenting from it can be grounds for termination. So Hank, on the one hand, has to believe something that his private Protestant business condemns as heretical on this point, since we reject sola fide or justification by faith alone. And on the other hand, he has to believe something that the Orthodox Church, his church, condemns as heretical. It's bad enough when you have to contradict one doctrinal statement, but Hank has really outdone himself here in contradicting two at the same time. It's really not a tenable position. Now, he's free, I suppose, to get the board to change that doctrinal position, that CRI doctrinal statement on this and many other points. But if he were to do so, I would wager that that would endanger what's left of his evangelical donor base.
So everything is a cynical balance of powers act here.
I think there's some of that in play. You'd be a fool to think to have that kind of business, a multi-million-dollar business, and not recognize that.
All right, Perry, the phrase, though, that's sticking out to me in Article 6 is the phrase penal substitutionary atonement. Now, you and I both know that that's a cornerstone of most Protestant thinking. It's starting to change in some corners, but if you want to look at the big guns, people like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul, the idea of Christ taking our wickedness and our getting his righteousness by imputation, and then Christ being cursed by God, and then God turning his back on him on the cross, that's penal substitutionary atonement, and that is unorthodox.
Well, Hank has tried to use material out of Callisto Square's book to justify his subscription to penal substitutionary atonement. And he's done so by the material in Ware's book, where Ware talks about different language that can be overpressed to different emphasis. Now, all models have to deal with language of debt, of payment, of sacrifice, of ransom, of punishment under the law and suffering. All of that language is just biblical language.
Yeah.
And so all models, whether a penal model or satisfaction model or a Christus Victor model or a moral influence model, they all have to account for that language. So what Ware is talking about is you can press that language too far. Now, the CRI doctrinal statement is not using biblical language there that's accommodated, that you can accommodate to any model. What the CRI doctrinal statement is doing is picking out a specific theory by that language, which is the theory is even worse than what you glossed it as. It's that the Father inflicts harm on the Son in fulfillment of a legal debt or requirement. And what is that harm that's inflicted on the Son? It's not just physical death. What is the penalty for sin? On that schema, classical Reformation schema, it is separation from God or loss of communion with God. Now, from an Orthodox point of view,
that means you have a
is simply impossible.
Right, you would have a divided Trinity. What's especially interesting about that is Hanegraaff put out a book called Counterfeit Revival. In that book, he excoriates Jesse Duplantis, who's a Word of Faith preacher, for saying that the Holy Spirit is separated from the Father and the Son. But R.C. Sproul gets a pass when he says the Son is separated from the Father on the cross.
Right, and I mean, Jonathan Edwards said that Christ experienced the torments of hell on the cross. Now, the Reformed authors like Francis Turretin and others tried to dance around this problem, but the Orthodox aren't the only people who make this objection. This is a standard objection from Catholic theologians against the Reformation. But all of that aside, Hanegraaff really doesn't know what he's talking about, and the larger point is, what faith does Hanegraaff profess? When he talks about, he's issued statements that he still believes in salvation by grace through faith. Well, that's great. So does Rome. So does just about everybody. Now, to be fair to professing Christians who adhere to Reformation theology, they have a point. His own doctrinal statement says he has to believe in justification by faith alone. And Hank will not come out and say, no, I don't believe that, and here's why I don't believe that. It's always dancing around the issue. You can see this in his statements, public statements on have I left the Christian faith and so on and so forth. He'll never address the issue directly.
Well, we'll get to that more thoroughly in just a moment. But Perry, the issue with penal substitutionary atonement is that, yes, indeed, you may be able to find language like that in patristic writing. You may be able to find some even illustrious Orthodox people who espouse PSA. For example, I have an audio tape of Thomas Hopko saying things that sound very much like penal substitutionary atonement, and John Whiteford, a priest in the Rocor jurisdiction, has written approvingly about vicarious atonement in his blog. But the thrust of the matter is it's an imported doctrine. If you just walk into a priest's office in an Orthodox church and you say, why did Christ have to die? He'll usually say something along the lines of, it's about healing the human condition. Now, if you press him on issues and say, well, what about these verses in Mark 10:45 about ransom and so on and so forth, he won't probably have a fully orbed answer to it. But the instinctive answer is that this is about healing. It's not about vicarious punishment. So Hanegraaff, he's basically going to come into Orthodoxy and just bring in an imported view, and again, have to compartmentalize, as we spoke about moments ago, because if God the Father turns his back on Christ, then you have a divided Trinity. And that the Trinity, everybody would agree, is a big box. So
that's the biggest box.
Right,
if we're going to do boxes, that's the biggest box.
Exactly. If you're not worshiping the Trinity, then you're worshiping a false god. So if you have penal substitutionary atonement, you have something that runs athwart the big item of all the items in theology. You basically now have to have a false god because you have a divided Trinity.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. I think with Father Whitford and others, I think there's a lot of word concept fallacy going on there. Nobody disagrees that the atonement is substitutionary. Christ dies in our stead. Every model has that. And all the language, for example, in the medieval Latin scholastics, there's all that language of debt and payment and sacrifice and suffering under the law. But people like Aquinas or Anselm, they did not believe in a penal substitutionary atonement. So you have to do more than just point out that biblical language or patristic language is there.
Well, Anselm believed in a type of vicarious atonement, but the type of atonement that Hanegraaff is espousing has been greatly modified by at least 5 major arguments from modern Protestants. All right, Perry,
that's right.
Yeah, Perry, let's move on. Let's talk about the phrase through faith alone. That concept's not exactly compatible with Hanegraaff's new faith either, is it?
No, that doctrine, as I explained before, was rejected by the Orthodox Church at the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672. It's explicitly rejected by the church there. Not to mention the fact that it's simply not taught in the Fathers, and it doesn't matter what Orthodox church you're going to go to, in whatever country you're going to go to, you're not going to find justification by faith alone taught there.
Now, Perry, let's pause for just a moment and tell the listeners what that means in Lutheran and Reformation theology.
Yeah, so as I said before, the doctrine of justification by faith alone is that human acts cannot participate in increasing or contributing to your legal standing before God. So none of the virtues, faith, hope, and love, can serve as a ground for the label or declaration that you've been justified or are just. Rather, the ground for that is the merits of Christ that he earned as a human being in this life. And so the idea is, well, these virtues are worthless for justification in terms of contributing to them. Faith, the idea is faith is like a pipe. And this pipe can transfer moral merit and moral demerit or moral credit. And so the idea is that faith is the empty hand that reaches up and lays hold of the merits of Christ. And so Christ's merits are applied to me as a matter of law. So I'm grouped as righteous or classed as righteous even though I'm not. And my demerits, my wickedness, is imputed or transferred along this pipe of faith, this highway of faith, to Christ, which is why Christ has to suffer in my stead the separation from God on the cross. So that the doctrine of justification by faith alone is not the idea that I believe and then God does everything else. It is not even the doctrine that I believe of my own free will and then grace comes to me. It's part of a wider system where God causes you to believe. And then that belief acts as the conduit for the transfer of merit and demerit. So that's what the doctrine of justification by faith alone is.
Wow,
and that is
Perry.
not a doctrine taught by our church. It's just not taught by Orthodoxy.
Perry, you sounded like the Heidelberg Catechism there. I'm extremely impressed. In fact, I have The Freedom of a Christian right in front of me by Martin Luther, and he confirms exactly what you described. This is what Martin Luther himself writes, quote, "Since faith alone justifies, it is clear that the inner man cannot be justified, freed, or saved by any other work or action at all, and that these works, whatever their character, have nothing to do with this innocent man." End quote. That's Martin Luther, who originated the idea of justification by faith alone. All right, Perry, I interrupted you when you were saying that this is not the teaching of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah, it is not the teaching of Orthodoxy. On this point, we would agree in general with the Roman Catholic Church that under the power of divine grace, of divine life, that our acts and God's acts are one of the same, the acts of faith, hope, and love, and that this produces a just state in us, divine justice, and we grow in this as a process throughout our life. Now, with Abraham in Romans 4, Abraham is justified by faith apart from works. Well, why? Because virtue was the only faith was the only virtue that he had at that point. This does not mean that he couldn't acquire other virtues as he goes on, which is how we read James 2, that the works that Abraham does complete his faith. They make up part of that faith. This is, in Catholic terms, this would be the notion of formed faith. So James asks, can such a faith save? That is, a faith that doesn't have this formation. And James, of course, says, no, that can't save. So good works done under the power of grace, under divine power, they please God and they complete our faith. So they're not mere signs or effects as they are on the Protestant view. On the Protestant view, faith and works have to be together, but one doesn't contribute or participate in the other.
All right, Perry, you have been Anglican, you've been Reformed, you've been through the whole range of Protestant thinking out there, and now you're currently Orthodox. You've brought up James chapter 2. I'd like to know what the responses would be from the Reformed position and then from the Orthodox position. I'll just recite the verses to you. Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. So that would be James chapter 2, verse 24. How would the Reformed understand that, and how would the Eastern Orthodox understand it?
Well, it would follow what I said before, that the Reformed will argue that the passage is generally talking about justification before men. That is, giving evidence to the world that your faith is genuine. And so a genuine faith will always produce good works. This does not mean that the good works are meritorious or please God. So that would be the general Reformed gloss or interpretation of that passage, and that's easily verifiable in any Reformed commentary on James.
All right, let's stay there for just a moment, Perry. We talked about when you were Reformed, you would have said this is justification in front of men. But the preceding verses read, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Well, how many people were there viewing that for him to be justified in their sight? How would the Reformed handle that?
Well, I don't have a myriad of Reformed commentaries in front of me, but generally they're going to point to the fact that this is a public act that Abraham is doing, and therefore it's a display or a manifestation, again, of his faith. And so they would argue it doesn't prove that faith is not the only virtue by which the declaration of justification comes to us. Rather, again, it's just showing that a genuine faith will always produce good works. That they have to say this to maintain that wall of separation between human participation in sanctification, what's called progressive sanctification, and excluding human participation in justification proper. So you will often hear professing Christians of Reformation tradition saying the problem with Orthodoxy is they confuse or conflate justification and sanctification. For them, again, humans can't participate in God's justifying act of the sinner. And that's because the justifying act has to be complete. It can't be partial. It doesn't admit of any degrees. It's a zero-sum game. It's an all-or-nothing deal. You're either justified or you're not. Whereas, say, for Augustine in the Western tradition, or even Chrysostom in the East and other figures, justification is a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree by progress through the virtues with divine grace. And so part of the problem with the Reformation understanding, when you talk about good works done under the power of grace, the way that they're thinking of it is like two men pulling a load. To the extent that one doesn't pull, the other has to pick up the slack. So they're like two people who are contiguous. They're next to each other, and they're both exerting effort. Well, that's not how, for example, Augustine or other people in the pre-Reformation tradition think of it. They don't think of our act of giving the glass of cold water to the thirsty person, for example. They don't consider that act as a different act than what God is doing. Why? Because Christ lives in me, the hope of glory. Christ, it is not I who live, as Paul says, but Christ who lives in me, right? Paul says in Romans 5, God has poured forth his love into our hearts. And then he says in later on in Romans that love is the fulfillment of the law. So the law is fulfilled, Paul says, in us, not exterior to us. So this is why they think that you're adding works on top of grace. Rather, we see the works as energized by divine grace, by divine power.
Perry, this is an extremely deep issue, and I would love to revisit it at some future point, but we've got to move on. Ladies and gentlemen, the blog is energeticprocession.wordpress.com. Perry, I want to go into what I'm going to call the shooting gallery section of our interview. We're going to return to CRI's statement of beliefs. I'm looking now at Article 5. I'm abstracting a sentence therefrom. It reads, "Every human being is radically corrupt and estranged from God." That's what we would call total depravity. Can you address the orthodoxy of that particular doctrine?
Well, to be fair, it can mean total depravity. And the reason why I say that, to be fair, is that CRI employed a lot of different people. So one of the people I knew, Tom Snyder, he was a Quaker. Okay? He doesn't believe in total depravity. At least he didn't when I knew him. So the language is crafted in such a way that it can be read that way, but not necessarily. So it's crafted to capture a general Protestant view on human inability, but when you scratch it just a little bit, it's hard to say really what that means, because it's designed to accommodate Wesleyan Arminians or Presbyterians or Quakers or Calvary Chapel people and Vineyard and everything else in between.
So there's a little bit of deliberate ecumenical vagary in the statement of beliefs.
Right, and CRI has to do that given the kind of business that it is. So yeah, on the face of it, an Orthodox would probably not be happy with that kind of statement. Well, why? Because in Orthodoxy, to put it bluntly, humans are not more powerful than God. And that sounds kind of strange, but if you think about it, human choices cannot overturn what God has willed human nature to be. And, for example, St. Maximus says if it could, then everybody would end up having a different nature because everybody sins in their own unique personal way. So human sins do not change the imago Dei, the image of God. That is something eternal. Now, we can lose divine power and our natural powers are disordered and they don't work right and things like this. But the image of God in man is not erased by human choices. So that language is really problematic because it could be very easily seen to imply that the image of God is somehow altered in and of itself or lost.
Perry, I'm going to return to Article 5. I'm going to extract another sentence therefrom. That sentence reads, "Human beings are condemned by God because of their descent into sin, both through their relationship to Adam and through individual choice." That's the end of the sentence. Perry, that sounds like federal headship and original sin. Could you explain those terms and comment on Article 5 again for me, please?
Yeah, the notion of federal headship is more or less a distinct Reformation doctrine. It's kind of a thinned out version, an altered version from Augustine's notion of corporate humanity and a kind of corporate sin or a corporate analogous guilt that we all bear, that Augustine thought came down through sexual reproduction. The sexual reproduction itself for Augustine wasn't evil, but it was transferred through it. So federal headship is this kind of legal or covenantal structure where Adam acts as a legal representative for the whole race. And so in Adam's sin, that guilt is then legally transferred. It's imputed to every member of the human race, infants all the way down, apart from any action or choice they may ever undertake, and prior to any choice that they do take. So children are imputed guilty for Adam's sin, from the get-go, from conception forward. And this, by and large, brings about an actual corruption in human nature. If you want to see the standard discussion of this, it's John Murray's little book called The Imputation of Adam's Sin. It's a standard Reformed work. Now, again, this language in the CRI doctrinal statement is entirely compatible with federal headship. It's also compatible with other Protestant doctrines. It's going to be a lot harder to make this compatible with an Orthodox understanding of ancestral sin or original sin, or how the relationship between our first parents and the fall and us. So it's at least prima facie problematic.
Perry, if Hanegraaff had decided to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy in one of the Russian jurisdictions, that would be the Orthodox Church in America, OCA, or the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, ROKOR, he would have a better time of that because those groups are more Augustinian than the other jurisdictions. The difficulty is Hanegraaff converted to Eastern Orthodoxy in the Greek Archdiocese. And when one looks in the Orologion, that's the list of saints, when one looks in the Orologion, Augustine of Hippo isn't even listed. So this is going to be a big problem for Hank. All right, Perry, let's move on to Article 7. It reads, quote, "Those who have received the free gift of salvation will be raised from the dead or raptured, snatched up from their earthly lives, to meet Christ at his second coming." End of the quotation. Now, Perry, you read through 38 volumes of Church Fathers. How many times did you see the word or the concept of rapture?
0. The rapture is part of a larger theological system known as dispensationalism that was created in the 19th century, principally by John Nelson Darby and then popularized by C.I. Scofield through the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, again, with this statement, it's vague enough to accommodate lots of different eschatological positions or positions on the last things or the end times and after death. And that's because, again, CRI had to accommodate lots of different Protestants. So it can allow for that. Now, the idea of rapture is a distinctly dispensationalist doctrine. And given that CRI at the time was situated in Southern California through and continuing towards the end of the Jesus movement, a lot of which centered around Calvary Chapel and Chuck Smith in Southern California. And people have to understand that up until recently, you'd be hard-pressed to throw a rock in Orange County and not hit a Calvary Chapel. They were so pervasive that people there thought you weren't even a Christian if you didn't go to one, because they were just everywhere. So part of that doctrinal statement is accommodated that large Jesus people and heavily dispensational theology. I mean, one of the cardinal doctrines, I was joking with a friend of mine today at Calvary Chapel, is sola raptura, as one of my Reformed friends used to joke. That's the one doctrine that you can't question.
Only the rapture.
Right. That's why that language is in there. Now, if Hanegraaff positioned himself and altered the doctrinal statement at key points and made it wider to allow for an Orthodox view, that would be better. But it's still a problem of he's still teaching and being represented as a teacher, and he hasn't even been in the church a year. And then what are his qualifications to teach in the church? He has none. He has none as a Protestant.
Well, Perry,
so,
what kind of eschatology would he have to have if he's Orthodox? You know, I know that for myself, you know, my eschatology is extremely skimpy. It would be around about Acts 1:11, or as it says in the Nicene Creed, "He shall come again with glory to judge the living and the dead." So the second coming is about the only hard and fast rule I have in eschatology. But there simply is no tradition in Eastern Christianity for a rapture. Yet here is the rapture in the Statement of Beliefs for Hanegraaff's private Protestant organization. Yeah,
I think that's problematic. But for my part, I really think that Article 6 with justification by faith alone is really the most problematic, because there's no disjunction there. It's not this or that. It's not salvation by faith alone or salvation by faith. It is very specific, and there's no wiggle room around that. It's not trying to accommodate different views. It's trying to exclude all the other views. So these other statements, I agree, are on the face of it, or prima facie, they're problematic. And while Hanegraaff does have a eschatology that's more amenable to orthodoxy, the position in Article 6 is really just not, it's a deal breaker. Well, he's going to have to give it up.
Perry, if you were on an ecclesiastical board in the Orthodox Church and you were reviewing the CRI Statement of Beliefs, would you give him wiggle room and say, as we hinted before, this is sufficiently vague that, yeah, he can still profess this? Aside from Article 6, of course, but I mean, I'm talking about stuff like the rapture and the federal headship and the radical corruption. Would you say
I would want to reword it.
Okay.
Or I would want to qualify it by statements about, for example, on federal headship, there's statements about, even though people are corrupted by sin, we're still bearers of the divine image. Divine image is not erased. Things like that. I would at least want to add those statements to weight things properly. So we don't deny, for example, that we inherit corruption, that we inherit a lack of divine power, that our natures don't work right, and things like this. We don't deny that. So we don't think that sin has no effect on us.
Right. We would say that we would probably say that we're damaged rather than saying that we're guilty. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, guilty tends to be used in terms of personal action. And so it's a term of praise or blame. It's a term of moral ascription attaching to acts of individual persons. So we would not want to talk about inherited guilt or imputed guilt. Those would raise all kinds of different theological issues, especially in Christology, that you could just create such a mess with Chalcedon. But that's a story for another time. So I think at the least we would have to require added statements to that to balance it out. But then, of course, it's kind of like historically in Anglicanism, to accommodate so many different positions, you start having to get really vague.
And you have to water down the 39 articles.
Right. I mean, well, even the articles can be interpreted in a more Lutheran sense or a more Calvinistic sense. It depends on which commentator on the articles you're looking at.
Ladies and gentlemen, the blog is found at energeticprocession.wordpress.com. The blogger is Perry Robinson. Perry, going back to the idea of whether these have to be renounced or not, let's set the Wayback Machine to, 17, 18, 19 years ago, to when you and I entered into the Orthodox Church. I got chrismated 19 years ago. Consequently, I can barely remember the ritual. So today, before going to the studio, I went online and I found the text of the chrismation ritual. Here is what the very first words of the ritual read. Priest, wilt thou renounce the errors and false doctrines of the Roman Latin or Armenian or Lutheran or Reformed confession? Answer, I do. Priest, dost thou desire to enter into and abide in the communion of the Orthodox Catholic faith? Answer, I do. Did Hanegraaff not have to say those things when he was chrismated in that Greek parish?
From my understanding from people who were there, he was not required to renounce Protestantism. Now, the funny thing about that for me, and probably for you, is I, like you, was received in the Greek Archdiocese. When I moved to Texas for graduate school, my wife and I were both received at a parish in Houston. And we had to renounce the baptismal errors or the faith ascribed to the bodies we were baptized into. So I was baptized Roman Catholic. So for me, it was Roman Catholic errors. And I had a really great I don't know. I wasn't clear on why the priest did that. The priest was really a great priest. He was this half Mexican, half Greek priest. And he was really a great priest, but he had me say it, and I wasn't going to argue with him. So, and my wife was baptized in the Episcopal Church, so for her it was all of the Episcopal errors, right? But we had to make some kind of renunciation, and I think that's very smart because it shows people, look, you're not that anymore. You have to give that up. There's a clean break, and this is you're kind of starting your life over in this way. Now, if you have any brains at all, if you're going to take a national figure whose job it is to articulate and argue for theological perspectives, who has been doing so self-confessedly for nearly 30 years from a Protestant perspective, you can see that it would be wise to have them make those renunciations. Now, I don't know the priests at his parish. I don't know what their reasoning was or wasn't with respect to that. But I think it was incredibly not a good decision not to have him make those renunciations.
Perry, have you made any attempts to contact the clergy at Hank Hanegraaff's parish?
Yes, we have. And when I say we, I'm including myself and other former employees and interested parties. I spoke to people at the parish in authority about a month prior. And I told, when I found out about it from them, kind of accidentally, they thought this was going to be great. And I told them this was going to be a moving train wreck. And there was all this baggage, and this needed to be dealt with, and we need to move quickly. So otherwise it's going to be a big fat scandal. I was asked not to say anything for that month, and I kept my word. I didn't say a peep.
You were asked by the clergy?
Let's just say that I was asked by people in authority at the parish not to say anything.
All right.
So after it came out, approximately the week after it came out, about third week or so of April, I sent an email to, I think, Father Dabner, the senior priest there. I told him who I was, what parishes I had been at, who the priests were, how to contact them. So I'm giving him all my bona fides. Then I'm a member in good standing. And then I was a former employee of CRI, that there are all these very serious problems. There's the Martin family, and there are a number of these other employees that Hank has seriously wronged. Marriages were broke up. Some people became atheists as a consequence of Hank's actions. Other people's careers were damaged and never recovered. And here I don't want to give the impression that I was some high-up figure in CRI, because I certainly wasn't. I long since recovered from the damage that Hanegraaff did to me personally, but a lot of other people haven't. And so I feel responsible to advocate for them and to help protect the church, because I'm in this kind of weird providential position of having worked there and having been reformed, and now I'm Orthodox. So we contacted the priest there, and I said, look, there's only a few ways this is going to break out. None of them are going to be good for the church, probably not good for Hanegraaff, and so we need to work together to kind of bring this to a close. So I was told two things. First, that the priests knew a year in advance of these problems. I don't know the extent of their knowledge, but they claim to know about these problems a year in advance. Secondly, I was told Hanegraaff just needs prayer. I replied and impressed on them the seriousness of this matter and that this was not going to go away or blow over because he's a national figure. And he's going to move to put himself in a teaching position in our church, most likely, very quickly, which, of course, he has. And I said, I agree that Hank needs prayer, but he also needs repentance. And he needs to make some gesture of repentance and apologize to people. And he needs to sit down and be quiet in the church for a few years. So don't begrudge him and his family conversion, but this is just flying in the face of most basic biblical and patristic principles.
The bottom line is, Perry, that you have done your due diligence in accordance with Matthew chapter 18, where it reads, if you have an issue with your brother, try to approach him personally. Obviously, that's not going to work with you trying to approach Hank Hanegraaff, but you have gone through the chain of command, which is a big thing in hierarchical religions like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And so far, it seems to not be producing the results.
Well, that's true, but what your listeners need to understand is this is not the first time. In the mid-'90s, about 30 of the former employees, we all went together to CRI to execute Matthew 18, and Hank threatened to call the police on us for being on the property. Many people have tried to go to his pastor, whoever that was at the time when he was in Protestantism, to hold him to account. And the only thing he has done is either flat out rejected it, threatened to sue us individually and corporately, or actually sue individuals. So,
like he did to Bill Elmore.
Like he did about Elmore, incidentally, while Bill Elmore is dying of cancer. Now, people may have problems with me because of Hank's cancer, but one, Hank is still putting himself out there as a public figure. He's not a recluse. So he's still open to criticism. Secondly, I'm not suing Hanegraaff. I'm just saying he needs to be Orthodox. And so he needs to issue some kind of apology to the people he harmed, at least try to reconcile, and he needs not to be a teacher in the church. I don't think that those are unreasonable requirements.
And Perry, this is also something we will need to do for the good of Hanegraaff's soul, because he is now apparently taking the Eucharist every Sunday at this church, and he is in a religion that takes this to be the actual body and blood of Christ. And Christ himself said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 and 24, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled with thy brother, and then offer thy gift. But apparently, Hanegraaff is rejecting the attempts to be reconciled with his brother. That is very spiritually dangerous if we're to believe what the Orthodox Church teaches about the Eucharist.
Well, I think it's dangerous just on any Christian tradition, especially within Orthodoxy. But you got to think about it. Okay, so he's suffering from cancer, and that's bad, and I don't wish that on anybody. But he's still putting himself out there as a public figure. He's moving at light speed to inject himself as a teacher through our church's official media platforms to support his private Protestant business. I don't know how that's an outreach to Orthodoxy to support a private Protestant business, but put that aside for the moment. If it were me, and I don't want to put him on the couch too much here, but you're facing a deadly disease. You're almost 70 years old. There's a good chance this is it. So it's time to pony up, get everything clean and ready, because you don't know when you're going to have to go down and meet your maker.
And Perry, on that note, we're going to have to close the show because we've run out of time. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on Hank Hanegraaff and CRI, and I hope I can have you back on the air again with me.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it.